We're here.
Hello, everybody. We're waiting for some more folks to join us from the waiting room. We'll give it just a second here. So my name is Claire Booth. I am president of Capital Crimes, which is, of course, the Sacramento area chapter of Sisters in Crime. And this is our November monthly meeting, so we're very happy to have you here. Before we get started, there were a couple of quick announcements that I wanted to share. We've got several very good things coming up, several of them in person, actually. On the 24th of November, which is a Sunday, we have the Farm to Foul Play Anthology launch party, which will be at Fowler Ranch Tap Brewery. And you can buy your very own copy of our anthology at that and say hello in person to other Capital Crimes members. That starts at 11 a.m. and the address is on our website. On the 1st, there will be I believe, what will be the very first Sacramento Noir at the Bar. It's going to start at 5:30 on Sunday, December 1st at Bike Dog Tap Room, which is at the corner of 65th and Folsom in East Sacramento. And they've got great beer and other drinks. They've got a food truck. It'll be a lot of fun. So stay tuned for some more information about that, but mark that on your calendars. We're hoping to start making it a regular thing to give an opportunity for authors to read some of their works in kind of a fun, relaxed environment. So if you can make it, that would be great. Then on December 10th, we have our regular feature, Meet the Author. That's a Tuesday starting at 7 p.m. Jennifer Morita will be talking about her debut novel, Ghosts of Waikiki. So Penny Manson will be doing her wonderful interview, as she always does with our Meet the Authors. And so this time it'll be Jennifer. Then on December 14th, we have our annual holiday party that starts at 1 o'clock. It is at the Spaghetti Factory in Rancho Cordova. And that is ticketed, the cost of the meal, and you can pay for that through the Capital Crimes website. So more information is on there, and you can just pay right then. We made it super easy, so we hope to see you there for that. But now I am thrilled to welcome all of our members, including ones from near and far. I see Susan McCormick out there, and other folks from out of the area who are wonderful members also of Capital Crimes. But
Claire,
I would like to introduce Jennifer Hilt. She is the USA Today bestselling author. She's written 24 books across 4 pen names, plus her urban fantasy trilogy, The Undead Detective. She teaches authors about story development in workshops and classes throughout the US. She has degrees in linguistics and literature, loves collecting dictionaries in unfamiliar languages, and shouting out tropes from the comfort of her couch. This last bit is the most important today because she's here to talk to us about her best-selling The Trope Thesaurus series and how tropes shape our writing. So, Jennifer, take it away.
Okay, great. I'm from Seattle too. I saw that there's another Seattle person there, so they know that yes, it is grizzly and gross today. Let me just get this booted up. So enjoy your sunshine down there in California. Great. Okay. All right. I always love it when things actually, when everything actually works. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. If you have any questions, just let me know or pop a question in the chat and we'll get to it. This is a brand new talk, which I'm very excited about because those are always super fun for me to make. So that means there may be things that you think of later, like, oh, just feel free to ask me questions because I haven't done this one a bunch of times. Let's see. Yes. I'm a USA Today bestselling author, and I've been reading since I was a very little kid and always loved, even as a kid, trying to think of how stories were put together. But it took me a really long time to get some tools to really be able to analyze how those things happened. And in particular, the pandemic was a really big turning point because we all had so much time on our hands, as you guys remember. And I was doing a lot of teaching then, and in working with students where we were talking about developing their stories, I realized we needed to have some common tools for like how we were going to structure things. And I noticed that when we were doing that, if we talked about certain things, like we'd say, "Oh, that's like an orphan," or revenge. Students would be like, "Oh, yeah, but that's a trope," and I wanted to write a good story. And so that made me think about, well, why is that like helpful that, why do we need this common language, but then why do people have these feelings about that? So this was like I said, the height of the pandemic. And so I just went back and kind of took a deep dive into a lot of my favorite books and movies and across all genres, and was really trying to think like, how are these put together? And it was like an epiphany that I kept seeing tropes pop out. And I realized, oh, there's tropes in everywhere and in everything. It's just a matter of how they're applied. So, and how they're used, which is a whole big thing. But that was just how I've kind of got started on this path. So I wrote my first book, The Trope Thesaurus, and just kind of put everything that I thought and believed. And at the time, there were zero books on tropes up for sale, which seems a little surprising now because it's become pretty popular. And people were interested right away. As soon as I put it up, the pre-orders started racking up. And I think it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time, which is it's nice that it happens when you've been around for a really long time. And there was also, as the time was coming for me to release my book, I noticed trope talk in the more general vernacular, like BuzzFeed and Netflix would be like, "What are your favorite, tropes dealing with like enemies to lovers?" Or, "If you enjoyed these tropes on Netflix, what about checking out these series?" So I felt like that, and I think also TikTok, the power of TikTok really helped push the word trope into kind of the mainstream consciousness more, where writers were talking about it. So anyway, that's just a little bit more background on me, on how I got to what I'm doing today. So yeah, here's my four book series, and this year I'm working, or it'll actually be next year. The mystery thriller one is going to come out, and each book is different in that the tropes are the same, but how you use them is different. Because I hate it when you buy a book and it has all the same content. It just makes me crazy. But anyway, and also it's much more interesting to look into different things each time. But the thing that you guys are probably familiar with Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, and I'm a big fan of his story structure. And there's a quote in there that a movie producer said to Blake, "Give me the same thing, only different." And long before I even started down this trope journey, I had read that quote and was always like, yeah, yeah, what's that thing? If I could figure out what that thing is, I would feel like, oh, I'd really unlocked, a better understanding of how stories worked. And so it was only when I was doing this trope work and then I went back and reread that book that I was like, oh, what they were saying was give me the same trope, only different, at least in my view. And I can give you a couple non-mystery examples about that. For example, the virgin trope, which I think, pretty much seems like at this point in time in the 21st century, what else? Nobody's really that interested in it. It seems like it's a very old trope. But then I was thinking, oh, but the 40-year-old virgin, that movie took that trope and twisted it. And then another example, I think, is I was just in Las Vegas, so it was reminding me of the Hangover movie. And I really enjoyed that movie. And what I enjoyed about it, it was a twist on the amnesia trope, and the way that kind of unfunneled is like a mystery of like what happened to these guys. So these are just some examples of how tropes, you know are used in different ways, but yet based on a common idea. So the other thing that I think is really important with storytelling that I think tropes can help us with is this whole idea of complex characters, simple plot. And this is true even in, or especially in thriller or mystery, because we don't want to get so caught up in all the details that we don't have our characters rooted, our readers rooted in following our characters. It's really great to have a really great plot twist, but it's really the characters that always are the thing that we go back to again and again. And I am reminded of this because my husband and I have just been rewatching the Sherlock series from the 2010, I think was when it came out. And we watched the first and second series and we were just like, ah, the, those are so good because there's such character driven stories. Yes, the mysteries are great and that's, part of it, but it's really all the interactions of Sherlock with his family and his people he deals with at work and his relationship with John and just it's like and Mrs. Hudson and all those kind of things and of course his relationship with Moriarty. And so those are really even when we're talking about things like mystery and thriller really important to keep in mind. And that's also why we see series that are so popular where our readers come back because they want to keep seeing what that detective or private eye or police officer or whatever medical examiner has, what have they gotten up to now and what do they need? I always say to my husband, I got to go finish this mystery because it's not going to solve itself. So, we want to be involved in their world in that way. So I'm really excited, like I said, to talk about today's trope talk because it's really about scars and secrets. And I love Flannery O'Connor's short. She mostly did short stories in the middle of the 20th century, but I just love this quote because it really talks about the idea of scar and secret. So kind of using that as I work on my mystery thriller book with like keep going back to really where those early traumas lay. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about how tropes paired with goal, motivation, and conflict can form story structure. And in that, we'll be talking about our scars, the scar and secret. But first, let me back up and give you my definition of a trope. So I believe that a trope is a commonly understood concept. It's a neutral idea. There's no judgment on it. So, for example, loner, orphan, protector, and it's they're building blocks for stories. And by commonly understood concept, these are ideas that pretty much anybody over a sixth grade reading level is going to understand what these ideas are. If you say forced proximity, which is means like the idea of kind of the locked room, there's the locked room mystery or the locked house. They might not know like forced proximity in that way, but when you describe it as they're trapped somewhere, that is the whole idea of forced proximity. So there's just very few words that are actually that need some translation. It's like very instinctual as humans that we understand these relationships and what these basic tropes. So these are just some examples of tropes. Like I said, you guys are probably all already very savvy with them, but in case it's somebody who's new to them, and tropes aren't new. They've been around a really long time. I feel like the movie industry has been way ahead of us and talk of using them in calling them out and having them be very explicitly stated. But it's more recent that authors are using them in terms of like their blurbs and in their keywords. If you're doing Amazon or any kind of advertising, it's really helpful to know what these terms are so that reader you can find your readers. So I just wanted to give you guys some examples of them just so you kind of know what I'm talking about. So yeah, here's my another plug to read the Save the Cat if you haven't, because I really think it's really helpful with how to think about tropes. So why are tropes important? And this was really interesting because to me that the power of them, as I said, lays in their ability to engage with our authors immediately. We don't have to go through a lot of razzmatazz and explain, all these things. We can say, oh, this person has these characteristics and they have a problem. So they're really there to help us hook our audiences immediately. But the other thing that I discovered about tropes, which is I really, really think the element that we don't aren't as conscious of, is that tropes are really about relationships. So even when we say like when we think of like all the orphans that are out there that we deal with in stories, by the nature, an orphan is a vulnerable individual, but there's always orphans. That orphan doesn't isn't in isolation, even though that's how they start the story. They're going to go on a journey or a quest. Those tropes to have a found family, they always develop their little, cadre of friends or people that they meet along the way. And all of those are really examples of relationships, good or bad. So it's really interesting to realize that's when people are like, oh, it's just a trope, and to realize, but what it's really speaking to is the relationship that's behind it, that's below the kind of like at the surface level. of the words. And that's what I think audiences respond to, and why audiences really love tropes, that they're like there for them. And it's this kind of us as authors who have to realize, okay, I take this concept that people understand, and then I put my twist on it, my spin, I develop it in my way to make it very special to my story so that it doesn't come across as, flat or boring. And then this idea that tropes are neutral story blocks, which I really like, in that you can, if we go back to that idea of the orphan could be the hero, the orphan could be a side character, the orphan could be the antagonist. It's not it's not the same as kind of having a villain, or as we're going to talk about, they're not the same as stereotypes or cliches. And this was a big thing in my work that I needed to figure out, of how do you separate them. And for me, I really feel like a stereotype or cliche has a value judgment to it. So something like the idea of a dumb jock or a dumb blonde or nerd, they're like derogatory. Or you can just say, you could have a trope as the person is an athlete, or the trope that the person, is highly intelligent. And then you can take those characteristics and, like I said, develop that character to be the protagonist or the antagonist or the side character, or whatever you want, or a suspect or a victim. So to me, I don't at all see that tropes are the same as stereotypes or cliches. So that's kind of the theme that runs throughout my work. And by separating them out like that, it gives you this, like, just a very large pile, basically, or content of ideas to work with. I would say that there's probably between 50 and 60 tropes that I see, depending on how you want to categorize them, that we have as authors that we can use to lay down our story foundation. So what I wanted, so these ideas are kind of hard to discuss, I find, without using some specific examples. And I am a huge Tana French fan, and we need like the slightest bit of encouragement to talk about her stuff. So you guys are the victims today for this. I didn't read this story when it first came out. It took me a while to get to it for her series for some reason, but it came out in 2007, and she was an Edgar Award winner, and then I think she won a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's the first in her Dublin Murder Squad series, which is, I think, 5 books, if I remember correctly. And it's a really, really, if you haven't read it, I'm going to be talking about in general, but and I still want you guys to go back and read it if you haven't in your free time, and think about the things I'm talking about. But it's really an interesting story because she kind of merged, it's a police procedural, but also a psychological thriller, in that she really goes so deeply into the relationships of the characters, of the detectives and the suspects and the victims. And it's a really, like, just kind of being an armchair psychologist, which is pretty awesome. So, as a murder mystery, there's a couple tropes. When we are talking about murder mysteries, there's a couple tropes that are a given, and those would be the ticking time bomb and the MacGuffin tropes. And if you aren't familiar with MacGuffin, that's really basically the idea of it's an object that everybody's searching for. And the easiest example I can give, if it's an unfamiliar idea for you, is to think of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark, which everybody is searching for in the movie, that's a MacGuffin. So anytime you have anybody searching for, usually is an object, but it can be a person. That's a MacGuffin, and so we see those obviously all over the place in murder mysteries. And then the ticking time bomb trope, which is just having an element of it, this has to be solved by a certain time, or basically everything is just gonna go to hell in the handbasket idea. And that's, we also see those in all the mysteries, because what kind of mystery are we going to create if we have no urgency to solve it? We need to have this pressure on our story that we need to solve it, because to stop the killer from striking again, or justice for the family, or whatever the reason is, but we need to make sure there's that pressure on the story. And if you're new to looking for these kind of tropes, once you start to look for them, you're going to see them everywhere, like literally. It kind of makes me laugh. I think of the Sixth Sense movie where the little boy says, "I see dead people," and I'm like, I feel like I see tropes. I see them because it's not just in books that we see them. We see them on obviously TV and movies. I see them even in commercials of like why this one commercial works over another is how they've developed the interactions or relationships of the character plays, fairy tales. Those are the reasons why they've stuck around all these years is that you can trace them back to storytelling in our human history. So anyway, back to the big tropes for the mystery part of this story is a young woman was killed, Catherine Devlin, and this is the main thing is who killed her is what we want to figure out. And the that's like the main mystery that the detectives will have to figure out. The main detective, Rob, has a trauma that is a huge storyline to this trope, and that he was playing with his friends as a child, and two of them disappeared and were never found again in the woods near his house. Now he's called back to a murder that happens in the same place, probably 20 some or almost 25 years later, and his identity he has changed his name, and he hasn't told anybody who he is, so he's desperate to solve this case because he wants to feel like he can have closure. So he's basically taken back to himself, fighting this kind of going back to himself as a helpless child and trying to figure out what happened to him and to his friends because he has amnesia from the event. And this is just a little sidebar to say how much I love the amnesia trope in when it's applied in different ways. A lot of times we see the amnesia trope applied in that a character gets wonked on the head, they lose their memory for a while, and then when it's convenient, they gain their memory back. But there's a lot that can be done with the amnesia trope, and I think the beauty of the amnesia trope is hidden in these scars and secrets where you're having them hidden and then they are reappear later and they have to work through the damage of what that was caused. So this is like there's like two murder mystery storylines going through the story. And as I said, those are the tropes that are kind of representative of those storylines. Now, the other thing is that Rob and Cassie, the detective who's assigned with him, is the relationship of their relationship going through this story, and their relationship is wonderfully complex and one of my favorite relationships, really, in all time of all my books because I feel like this author is just the master of nuance and really going through and the details that she notices the little changes of relationships of people you work with, those you love, that really takes time to develop and remember and be just so observant to notice all these things. So that's kind of it's really like an attention to detail and care that just always knocks me out of the book. So anyway, but Rob and Cassie, over the course of their book, they have several different kinds of relationships within tropes. They start out as best friends, they become lovers briefly. Of course, that's forbidden because they're working together on a case, and eventually, this is not a romance, so there is not a happily ever after. But it's really great because, like I said, she just takes that relationship down to such a detail that you just are like literally watching it like a fly on the wall kind of transition very slowly. So forced proximity, I just talked about that a little before. That is a very important with setting, and we see that in all murder mysteries. And there's multiple uses of the forced proximity trope in this story. So there's the murder squad HQ where all the detectives are, and that's like its whole kind of ecosystem in terms of what's happening there with the politics of who's on what case and information, and kind of just a lot of hierarchy in that department. There's the murder site anthropologists, which is where this young woman, Catherine Devlin, her body was found at their anthropology site. So there's a whole bunch of discussion of what the interactions were, the pecking order, the relationships of these anthropologists working on this dig. And then there's the woods or slash the neighborhood where Rob had disappeared all those years ago, and where there's now families living. And that just kind of like what is the kind of feel or the who lives there now and what their stories are. And in particular, we go very into detail of the victim's family and getting to know her father, mother, sisters of what happened to this young woman. So, and all of those settings really are just very almost like sealed. You really feel like you just go into them and you've entered these other worlds, but yet they interlap, they interact and touch each other as the story unfolds. So, scars and secrets. You've probably heard the writing advice, give everybody a scar or a secret. And I believe that's really true. But the more I do this work, the more I read and see and think about all the stories that are out there, the more we can tie scars and secrets together. And the more that secret can be so germane to the character. Like if you're writing a lighter story, like a cozy mystery, then the secret could be something that's not doesn't have to be necessarily as devastating. It could be embarrassing. It could be something that you would rather not reveal, but it's not going to necessarily like obliterate the character. But if you're doing a more of like a psychological thriller like this, you're or mysteries, you're really going to have secrets that deal with trauma or some kind of past thing that just the characters will do anything to keep to themselves. So I just keep seeing that the more that those two things are linked, the more that you can have your audience rooting for the characters and understanding, oh, this is such a like, how are they going to get out of this situation? Because it's just so overwhelming. So the kind of trifecta, I guess, that I've been thinking about that I'm working on lately is the secret scars and shame. And that's really Rob has this incredible shame of like the survivor's guilt of why did he survive when his two friends have gone missing and were never heard from again. And he's just he really he thinks he's over it. He thinks he's gotten on with his life, but he really hasn't. It's causing him a lot of blind spots that work wonderfully in the story. But it's just, I think, a really great example of for us to think about what are the kind of secrets and scars that cause shame in our character. And I was able to talk to a psychiatrist about this, and was asking like, what are like the hardest things to overcome? And he said shame is like the hardest emotion, like not to overcome in terms of like the things that happen to people, so it isn't necessarily a lost love or something like that, but it's just like this sense of shame. So that's why I was like, oh, that's why we keep seeing it again and again. That's like really awesome. So anyway, that's just something to think about, like when you're working with your characters of going of with scars and secrets, like what really causes them like shame that they will do anything to prevent that from coming out, because that uh provides you really great motivation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So also the tropes of red herrings and suspects, those are obviously things that we're going to have in our mysteries, and we have them aplenty in this book. But they're going to be the family, the friends, and some strangers. Really, all of our we discover in our mysteries, everybody's like, oh, it couldn't be anybody from around here. We're all good people. It has to be some random person from out of town. And we know that in reality, in the real world, a lot of crimes are committed by those who are known to people. And it's very in doing all my reading and research, it's very similar in our books and in our stories, right? It's not often this stranger who's coming through town. It's, oh, the sweet little lady down the week she turned down the street. She ends up having like a shovel and a bunch of like bodies in her basement for people who she didn't think should be living or something like that. But it's the reason why that those kind of things happen, and why the antagonist will turn out in the end to be somebody who's under a different guise, is because it's just so much more hitting to home in the relationship venue. If you can write somebody off as a stranger, they're not from around here, they're out of town, we're not like that, that's one thing. But if it's somebody who you've grown up next to, or you have Thanksgiving dinner with, and you find out they have this other very dark side to them, when they've been very close to you, that is another really great way that we see that. Also, that's another reason why that's another common reveal we see with like the hidden identity, is that, oh, this other side of a person comes out. But anyway, red herrings and suspects, we have a bunch of them in the book, and starting with her father and a young man at the dig site, and then gradually they go through the reasons why those people are not who would have committed the crime, and they have to keep digging down for who really is responsible. So the victim's family, we find that the victim is a twin, and that her other twin has some developmental delays, and so she's not really able to be very reliable of kind of what was happening with her sister's life. But the young woman who died also was a an aspiring dancer, and she had a whole found family of people in this dance studio, and she was heading off to Dublin for a scholarship. So she had this whole other life that she had, a professional life that she was developing. But there, she also had all these other great things, secrets and scars, hidden identity, and all of, and the basically a lot of this relates to her relationship with her older sister, who is extremely jealous of her, and we find plays a much bigger role in Caitlin's death. So the end that brings us to the antagonist Rosalind, who I always love it when an antagonist is female because it's just still, I think, takes us by surprise. And so yeah, spoiler alert for the story. The antagonist was her actual older sister. But she sets it up so that somebody else quite nicely takes the fall for her. So my homework for you guys to see how this is done is if you have ever seen the movies Body Heat and or Indemnity, they're older. The Body Heat's old one with Kath William Hurt and I'm trying to remember her name, Kathleen Turner, is really great in terms of like you just at that time you just didn't know that women could act like that in a movie. We were kind of used to this more black hat kind of characters. So check those out because they're really great in terms of antagonist and red herring, hidden identity, the kind of things we were talking about. But Rosalind is just a wonderful character because she sets up from the beginning how to play the detectives off of each other, and she's extremely skilled at doing that within her own family. So she's really the most unlikely of nobody ever even suspects her in the beginning. And in the end, she's able to really escape any kind of serious retribution because she also ends up being under 18. So told you about a whole bunch of tropes that you can find in that book. But now I want to talk about how it's not just tropes that can help build your story structure or help you think about developing your characters or revising. You can use all these techniques for whichever stage you need to. Deborah Dixon, I think this book's probably about 20 years old, Goal, Motivation, and Conflict. And what I really like about this book is it really breaks down these very central ideas. So if the goal, motivation, and conflict for your characters is new to you, this would be a great book to check out. But what I like to do is use them with tropes, like I said, to create story structure. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the goals of the characters. And for the goals of the characters, those aren't things that necessarily they like those are things that we need to know as authors for our characters, but they might not be as aware of them. It just depends on your for this story, definitely. Rob is wants to solve the crime. That's his goal. That it's meaningful and it's his job. And by meaningful, I mean we want our characters to have goals that if they don't reach it, their life doesn't just reset to basically, a happy plateau. It's going to cause some real problems. And that is also the part where I say measurable. So at the end of this book, either Rob's going to have solved this crime or not. And it's really important. I talk to romance. If you have anybody here who writes, like, if you got any of you guys write romance or, heavy romance subplots, this is, I think, really important because, and related to romance also, because a lot of times people will say, oh, well, I just want them to be happy or to be in love. But it's really hard to structure a novel based on something so nebulous as happiness or love. But this is why we see tons of stories of somebody who inherits a bakery or moves to a different town and has to start over and rebuild something, or a child winds up on the doorstep, or they need to get a promotion. These are things that we can build a story on because we have a goal and we have actionable steps. So I still think it applies to mystery that the goals need to be meaningful and measurable, and it's pretty straightforward to do with when you're setting up some type of crime thriller. So this is my little thing about the tough love, which I already told you guys about. And basically, yeah. I just talked to you guys about this. So, like I said, I think the really important thing is this is how we get the plot steps of a mystery, is that we're going to be on this adventure of getting to how they solve the crime, and we need to know like what's going to happen in that, and it gives us a footprint to do that. So motivation, the second part. So we've talked a little bit about goal. Now we're going to talk a bit about motivation. Motivation is where we find obviously the character's whys, but also where we find often the story themes. And I think something like theme is important to know for a story, but it's not going to be probably the first thing you think, or you when you sit down to work on a story, you don't usually think, oh, I'm going to sit down and write a revenge story. You might sit down and think, well, I have this idea of this thing I saw, and then remember something that maybe happened to you when you were, in middle school, and thinking of all these things like, oh, I could take these elements and put them into a story. And as you're working on them, the story themes usually emerge. And the for this story, and often is we see in mystery, is really restoring justice is a common motivator for mysteries. For thrillers, I think it's similar to restoring justice, or it's also like um, who's gonna survive, that kind of idea of living, of who will survive in the end when the bomb goes off or the anecdote is discovered. So motivation is where we find our story's theme. So it's really important that Rob's motivation is his identity as a detective is causing some conflict with his past trauma, um, as this victim, and he's really that's like a thing that causes him to not see the scenes and the things that are unfolding before him clearly, even though in his mind he's right on it, and he's not at all affected by the past. We can see as readers that he's struggling. So it's a difficult case to solve. He's blinded by his trauma and his current relationships. So those are all the conflicts that he's facing, as this is his first big murder case. The Cassie, the woman he's assigned to work with, also, she's never worked a really big murder case like this before. They're the youngest ones in the squad, so there's a lot of pressure from their boss and their coworkers to not mess this up. The young woman who was killed is in such a horrible way that there's a lot of public sympathy that this very random person who must have killed her, it couldn't have been anybody in the family or known to them, of course, gets apprehended. So there's just a lot of pressure on the case, which is awesome, because that's what we want, to keep turning and seeing how things keep turning the pages to see how things can get more and more difficult. So those are when I'm setting up my goal, motivation, and conflict for my stories or working with somebody, I usually keep fiddling with them until I can have the goal and the conflict be basically, in opposition for each other. They want to achieve this thing, but it's going to be basically impossible to do it. How could they possibly? So he wants to solve the crime, but there's so many ways, there's so many things that are going to come up to make it impossible for him to do that. And then the beauty of this story is not just that Tana French goes into a lot of detail about this one character of Rob. She goes into a great amount of awesome detail of his coworker Cassie, who ends up. This is also an interesting way that she structured this series. That is what you commonly see with romance, of where they'll introduce as side characters other characters that, so like Cassie in this book, she's a more minor character, and she ends up having a book to her own story from her perspective. But you like her so much in the stories, and she's such a much more likable character really than Rob, that you want to go on and read this next story to see what happens. So it's a very clever way to not only build her world for her characters, but also build a world so that we and readers want to keep returning to the stories, even if the story doesn't have one detective running all the way through, like say Longmire or Hercule Poirot or the Janet Ivanovich stories, something like that. But Cassie is a character who has the orphan, secret, scar, and protector as the basis for like her character identities also. So this is just to harken back to my what I said about the goal, motivation, and conflicts and story structure. And I think I have a slide in here that talks about well, I think where it kind of talks about how the details that we add come into play, but I can't remember where I put that right now. One of the questions I get is how can I break down the list of tropes into bite-sized information? So if you go and you just type in tropes in, some kind of search for the internet, you're going to get these big alphabetical lists. And so I found this really frustrating because I wanted to be able to think about them in like different ways. So I thought, well, what if I kind of organized them out into different categories or different, almost like buckets? And then I like to think of them as like I have these different buckets or piles of information that I can pull from as I'm working from my story. So I'm going to show you guys some ways that I kind of have broken down tropes to so you can think about them in different ways. And that's really kind of I feel like the most important thing for me about this trope work is I really want people to feel like they can take tropes and manipulate them and use them to work for them. They're not a thing that you have to be afraid of. They're not a thing that you have to be like, oh, I can only use it in this way. You can really build them, and by what I call like trope stacking, adding them together, you can do different things with them to create very unique characters, but that are relatable and recognizable to people. So I've tried to like these three ways. I've tried to break down some options that you guys can think about as you're working. So one of the ways is thinking about tropes is having, are they in the primary or secondary storyline? So if we're talking about mystery or thriller, like I said, we're going to see tropes in the ticking time bomb, MacGuffin, secret and scar. Those are like big tropes that are going to be in that main story. The secondary story line, excuse me, is where we tend to see more kind of like the softer or a little quieter relationship stuff. So there may be a slow burn relationship, romantic relationship, if it's a series where they're kind of starting to get to know each other. We especially kind of see these in cozies or sometimes in serial mysteries where they're just like most of it is the mystery, and then the secondary part tends to be more like some kind of romantic relationship evolving. Or there could be things about like their family life or things like that. But it's just kind of like the tropes. You don't have to use tropes all the same way to the same amount. So I think that's like a really important thing to think about. So the primary tropes for In the Woods are Rob's amnesia, who the antagonists are, this idea of the con of a con is like basically like, a lie, or who's pulling the wool over so and so or somebody else's eyes. And so that idea and then the family, because there's a lot of like what was going on in this young woman's family, this idea quest for the truth of what happened to Caitlin Devlin. And then again, going back to like what were the secrets that she was keeping her sister. The young woman knew her sister had been trying to harm her, had been slowly trying to poison her and get her in trouble and do a variety of things. And just the scar of also her coming from a rather a family that didn't have a lot of money, and she was trying to get out to Dublin to work in this dance world. So that was kind of a big deal for her. And then also the issues of her, like of the twin sister that I mentioned, who had the developmental delays. So those were kind of like scars that this young victim was also working with. The secondary storyline for the In the Woods again is you can see in this one you can see what I was talking about with more relationship issues, where you see the best friends. Those would be like some of the other characters that were in the story that the detectives were interacting with. That each have some things going on in their personal lives outside of work. And then this kind of love triangle that slowly forms as another detective starts working with them and expresses an interest in Cassie. So it's just kind of like neat that you see like, oh, this is where there's kind of more relationship-y stuff in this way for mystery. A second way that I like to think about tropes, okay, the first way is thinking about them, am I using as the primary or secondary? And the second way I think about them, I like to think about them as, are these tropes used to describe persons, places, or objects? And in the woods, the tropes for the persons, like we had just kind of talked about, I had mentioned earlier that Rob is really not a very likable character, and this is one that a trope that sometimes is used more often in romance, but really fits him is the alpha hole, where he thinks he's like all that, and he's very kind of dominant and arrogant, and it creates a great blind spot for him. Also, hidden identity, because like I said, he had changed his name from when he was a child, so nobody knows that he was the one who had that horrible thing happen. And loner, where he's like never really been able to form any attachments after he lost his two best friends. So that's one way that we can kind of think about tropes is, are these tropes used to describe a person, a person or a character? Then we can think about what are the tropes that are used for the location of like the place. So we talked about the forced proximity or quest, or I would also in quest, I was thinking of like how, again, it's like kind of people working together to achieve a goal. I guess I was also thinking of that in terms of like road trip. If you have a bunch of characters that are going to be, literally traveling somewhere as they solve something. So these are just other ways to think about, are these tropes involved in how I'm setting up the setting? And then finally, the object tropes, which are like the MacGuffin and the ticking time bomb that I mentioned earlier, because we're trying to figure out who the killer was and we only have a certain length of time. So these are other ways that we can think about what what the categories tropes can fall into. And then the third one that I was talking about is secrets and changes. So secrets, like I said, those are really digging down into like the hidden trauma of the characters and what is creating shame. And changes is really, well, secrets, I guess I have to talk about that first. Rob's amnesia, his hidden identity, and his relationship with Cassie. And then the changes are, what are the transformations that our characters undergo in the story? So some of them they end happily, or they are, become a more complete person, and some of their changes aren't so great, and they turn out to be kind of disappointing, or just the realities of human failings. So that's like another way to think about how our characters change, especially in mystery and thriller. Not all changes are going to be for the better. And one of the interesting things that I'm seeing with the domestic thriller market, which you guys are probably aware of, but like the Frida McFadden books that have just like, I feel like launched this whole very, very popular genre right now. And those are really very much a lovers to enemies arc, in terms of changes, and that there's also like they start out with the characters one way and this guy seems really great and they're whatever, and then it turns out that they're like pitted against that person later. So that's kind of an interesting little twist on the enemies to lovers, is to see that flipped around in the thriller market. So, like I said, I like to think of tropes as neutral building blocks. So, things I can use to help me set up a story, things I can use to help me get through the middle of the story, and to set up to a really satisfying conclusion. And so, yes, this was the thing I wanted to mention. So, I've been talking about how tropes and goal motivation and conflict provide the story structure, and that is totally true. But the thing that really makes them our own is how we are able to bring in our personal details. So, when we're talking about this book, the amount of detail this woman had about what it was like to live in Ireland and grow up in Ireland in the 1980s, what it's like to work in this office murder squad that was pretty patriarchal, and just there was a lot of tradition and very regimented, and what it was like to grow up in a very kind of like working class community, and what that was like for this young woman who was trying to get out on her ballet scholarship. So those details take us way beyond the original setup we had as we were starting to develop these characters. And when you look back at like the stories that you love, whether movies or books, and as you're working on your own stories, like think about those little details, because those are the things that really hook us as readers and are showing us like, oh yeah, these are real people. And I believe that's really the secret to developing tropes in a way that's really memorable and unique to your characters. And the kind of details I'm talking about are the physical descriptions, dialogue, interior thoughts, world building, how the character, like again, how the characters dress, just really any kind of thing that shows that you're not reading something that's just, it doesn't come off across as generic. It's like this world this woman created. I feel like if I went to Dublin, I would be able to go to the red brick building left over from the Victorian era that holds the murder squad. And I would be able to walk in there and I would see all these people like at their desks, grumbling and doing their paperwork. It's so real that you can like sense the senses pull you in of like, oh, the bad coffee that they have there and the stale air from all the cigarette smoke and the long hours and how people are exhausted and the smell of sweat and things like that. And it's like those things are what really those the use of those senses are what really ground our characters. So yeah, this is just what I was talking about, but don't be afraid to use your voice and bring your voice into the story and thinking about, what characters like I'm old enough that before Janet Ivanovich came out with her series, Sue Grafton was one of the first, or along with the V.I. Warshawski author, Sarah Pretsky, who at the time in the 80s, that must have been, there weren't a ton of female detectives, or actually very few. And they were coming out with them, and it was just like such just like, wow, great, like breath of fresh air into the, mystery reading community. And now we kind of take it for granted because there's so many great female characters that are detectives or private investigators and but at the time, it was like those were just really new. And the way they did that was with their voices were very specific. So with creating those female investigators, you could definitely tell who was a Sue Grafton character versus a V.R. Warshawski character, and that like persists today as we create these different kinds of detectives and things like that. And another example is if you guys haven't watched it, you have to watch on Amazon Prime Deadlock. And for somebody who consumes that stuff at an alarming rate, you think, what new could you possibly do with like a detective story? And it was like a lesbian detective in a small town in southern Australia. And it's just so good because there's just all these conflicts with the town and with her office mates and her partner and all these kind of things. And they're like things that we face in our everyday life, but they're just, again, given this specificity and a little bit of a detail of twist of details that you're just like, oh, it's fresh. It feels new and exciting. And so check out Deadlock on Amazon Prime. It's just really a great mystery series. Um, I am nearing the end of my presentation, so I wanted to ask if you guys, what kind of questions you have. The other things that we could talk about more would be Longmire from Craig Johnson. That's both the book and the movie, book and the TV series, which I think are both great. I've read and watched both of those. And the other one is my current obsession is Slow Horses because also again, book movie just so well done. And a lot of the things that I've talked about in here in terms of tropes and goal motivation and conflict and details you can see in both of those stories. So we could talk about those more altogether if you guys would like, but I just wanted to see if like you have questions or you want to ask me about projects you're working on. I'm always happy to do that. That's fun. So let me just show you. Let's see. This is my book that's going to come out next year, my Kickstarter. I'm going to do a Kickstarter with it. And the thing that I was excited about, if you guys I'm going to have a trope conference. So I'm gathering all of the smart people that are talking about tropes in different ways. And we're going to do it virtually in April. And we're going to have a bunch of different things talking about specific tropes. And we're going to talk about genres. And I'm just really excited. It's basically like my idea of Christmas. So if you want to find out more about this, I'm just starting to set it up. So the best way to do that would be through my email I'm sorry, joining my newsletter list, or you can always email me. And the ways to do that would be right through here. So you can from my website. But if you guys want to let me know what you want to do in terms of the chat, I guess I could take a look at that and
Did
see if there's
anybody
any.
have any questions that they wanted to ask Jennifer or any, problem they're working through on their own work in progress that they wanted to throw out there to have trope evaluated?
Yeah, yeah, or just plotting things or things that don't make sense that I mentioned or questions you have about particular tropes. I feel like it's a lot of information, but I also feel like I have a lot to tell you. So, um, yeah,
Oh, so a couple here.
great. Let me
Rick,
see.
do
I
you want
can't
to
really.
read those off or? Oh, Rick might have gone. Um,
Okay.
oh, well, do you have a favorite trope? Patrick wants to know.
Oh, I do. I do. Excellent question, Patrick. I would almost think you were a plant, but we haven't met before. Um, I love the amnesia trope. And I love it when it's not a bonk on the head. So for me, that's really exciting. So there's a couple examples of amnesia trope that I really enjoy. One is one is a fantasy, but it's also a thriller called The Rook. And it's about a supernatural MI5 by Daniel O'Malley. I love that one. And it's a young woman who wakes up and the story begins and she has no memory. And there's a whole, like, she has to do all these things to show that she's kind of faking it. It's just wonderful. So Daniel O'Malley's The Rook. I love that. Is a great example of amnesia trope. Annihilation, Jeffrey Vandermeer, I think it's Vandermeer, story about four women who go into a area that something has happened and we're not sure environmentally. And there's a use of the amnesia trope in that, also fascinating. And Severance, which is on Apple TV. I feel like such a smart use of the amnesia trope in terms of in a different way. So if you guys haven't checked out that, and especially for thriller writers, that's a really super awesome show. The writing of that is just great in terms of different ways because amnesia, there's like I feel like there's so much there that there's so much that doesn't get kind of unpacked. So I'm always like really curious if there's other way, people have found out other ways to use it because there's a lot in there. So thank you for asking that question because yeah, for me it's always fun.
Okay, so Brian, first off, says this is great. And is there a way to have a large cast of characters and not
Mhm.
drown in tropes?
Yes. Well, first of all, you want to basically not have them all. You're not going to have them all have the same tropes to the same degree. So even if you did a series where everybody in there was an orphan, all of those orphans would need to be different in some ways. They would have other characters around them. Um, so what we're doing is trying to create these complex characters, so that's why I kind of talk about trope stacking with some of the work I do, so that like you're making sure each character has like 3 to 5 tropes that define them or help you build out who those characters are. So and like I had talked about earlier, you're also going to have some tropes that are more the primary tropes and some tropes that are the more secondary, and like the best example is that slow horses that I mentioned. I mean, those characters are really fascinating, right? And they're all really different. But if you think about it, there's a lot of those characters are very tropey, as we would say. So the young man, oh gosh, I'm losing his name. The young man who lost his grandfather is like that is the head of the MI5, and
River.
he has. I'm sorry.
River?
Yeah, it's River. I was forgetting River's name. River is like there's a lot of things about his character that are, kind of tropey if we think about it, right? He's kind of like the heir apparent idea and the protector and a bit like the golden boy and all these kind of things that are supposed to be about him. And yet he has this like there's this like secret shame with what happened to his mom and all these kind of things. There's that about his character, which is really interesting. And then we think about like the character of Jackson. He certainly has a lot of secrets and shame with kind of what happened with him when he was directing agents in the field and having to kill a person. And then there's his and it of course is drinking also. And then we're thinking of like if you think of Catherine Lamb, who's the woman who's kind of holding them all together. Clearly, she has a lot of shame and secrets about her drinking and the loss of her boss, which she didn't realize was murder. Like so you can see that all those characters have a lot of qualities to them, but we don't feel overwhelmed by them and we don't feel like, oh, they're all the same. He just did a really great job of drilling down into like what makes them tick, all the other little characters in the office. And of course, you can't really talk about that series without the awesome Lady Di character who's running MI5 and is just, a wonderfully complex character where like sometimes you're just like, oh, you just can't stand her. And then other times you're just like, oh, I hope she through the skin of her teeth to survive, to live another day to run MI5. So you can see how if you take a really good story like that, or like the Longmire, where they use a really big cast and just kind of line it. Like what are the tropes they're using for these characters, and what are the tropes they're using to like set up the conflict. So a lot of times I will, if there's something I like, I will read it. I read it first or watch it obviously first, but then I'll like go back and watch it again or read it again and thinking about how does this put together? And it's just kind of like trains your brain and trains your eyes for like thinking of how stories put together. So I would say almost like with baking, you're going to use things to different amounts and different strengths with the tropes. But they're all there, and pick a thing that you really like. I think it's easier to not use your own work because we have such emotional investment in it. So pick a thing you like, and you're probably going to think, you might think, oh, there's not going to be any tropes in that. And it's just amazing when you start to look what you will start to see of how things were used. So that would be my suggestion, would be to think about them in terms of character development, and then in terms of what's the kind of strength that they're being used, whether, like kind of like a full strength or like a diluted version, or things like that. I hope, does that help? I can't see who asked that
Um,
question.
yeah, that definitely. And actually, that could leads into Deborah's question, which is, how do you know when you've chosen too many tropes that create
Mm-hmm.
complications that become overwhelming to readers? Like
Yeah.
how do you know when enough is enough?
Yeah. Um, I think probably the best way to know that is through like a beta reader, having somebody else look at it, to know if that's honestly, I see it's a bigger problem that people don't use enough, that there isn't enough conflict in stories. It's very rare that I'll read a story where there's like, oh my gosh, there's like way too much conflict in there. I feel like it's like we almost always don't put enough in. But I think the best way to get feedback about that would be to have somebody else look at it, who has a more objective view of it. And also to be thinking about the goal, motivation, and conflict. If you set that up, and if that plays out, then you're on the right track. But that isn't, I like I say, oh, goal, motivation, and conflict, but it's not like a thing that I sit down and I just like write out like a grocery list. Like I'll do a version of it and then let it sit, and I like I'm always kind of refining and working on it, as I'm getting started on a story, kind of like trying to drill down to like what's the most conflict ridden um setup I can create. So I think that's another way too, is to think about, because the goal, motivation, and conflict and the tropes do work together. So are they helping you as the characters, trying to reach the goal, or create, excuse me, or create pushback against the goal? So I think that's another way to look at it too.
Dover is wondering, is there a potential bad guy turns into the next body trope? If
Is
so,
there
how would you
huh?
spin it to make it different?
A potential bad guy who turns into an ex-body? Do you mean a suspect? They think like this is the suspect, and then the next thing we know, that person is dead. Is that what you mean?
Yep, that's the one.
Dover, feel free of chip to go ahead and chip in,
Yeah.
Dover.
That's the one.
Yeah, great, great. Well, I think that's great, and that's used all the time. And I would think of it as a type of hidden identity, because they're like basically it's kind of that idea of like you've gathered all the suspects in the room, and oh, we know who it's going to be, and then somewhere along the line the detective is like realizing, oh, it's actually not who I said. It's not that person, it's somebody else. And so they think that they're on the right track, and then there's like another, like the floor drops out and there's another layer. So I would think of that as a version of the hidden identity trope, which I think is fantastic, or a red herring, which is again where like you're kind of, you think it's probably actually, it's a kind, depending on how you want to use it, I would think of it either way, of those. And in terms of spinning it, I think the what you would want to spin is how, it has to be that like everybody thinks it's this person, including the detective and the reader, and then you introduce this other sliver of information, or turn the story just so we get a little more light on some other angle, and then you realize, oh, can't be this person. Of course it can't be this person. But then who could it possibly be? And being able to then show, oh my God, it's like the person that we never thought it would be possible. That's where like the big payoff to the reader comes. But that person has been hidden in plain sight all along. So if I go back to the story that I was just talking about with Tana French, we right away, boom, meet the sister Rosalind. And she's, completely trauma wrecked and, she's consoling the mentally disabled sister and all this kind of stuff. And so we meet her like right away. And so she's in our vision of suspects, but we never think of her as somebody who could possibly do this, where it's like, oh, it's got to be the father, it's got to be this other guy and all this kind of stuff. And so then only later, as we kind of more of the story opens out, you realize, oh, there's these other parts of her that we didn't know about. And then she's the big reveal in the end when they think it's a, some other person, and that, oh my God, it's actually she's the one who set it up. So I think it's really trying to think of beyond that character, what's your next bump, of who the big bad reveal will be when you've kind of shown that it's not the antagonist, as you say, or the antagonist turned next body or suspect.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the fun part, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Robin is wondering, are there YA mystery tropes that would be different from adult mystery tropes?
Mhm. A lot of times YA deals with identity issues that are not necessarily, I mean, there's obviously identity issues with adults, but really the YA is really like, kind of leaving childhood behind, moving into being an adult. And so there's you can see a lot of identity issues with that. The other thing I think that's really important with YA stories is this idea of found family as moving away from, their family of origin and, who their friends are and who the people are that they're choosing to associate with. And so I think those are really important tropes for the YA genre that you would still see in mystery and thriller. Um, I'm trying to think. And then with all the other stuff of like a ticking time bomb and those kind of things. And YA thrillers seem to be really popular now. I keep seeing I've seen a lot of them on Netflix, which I haven't been as interested in, but it's just been interesting to see them literary wise. It's the one, shoot, the young woman who is going to solve the crime as part of her school project, and that just came out. I know you guys had, I'm trying to think of what it was called now. But it's a famous YA thriller that's just been made into a movie, and I think it's on Netflix, and I can't think of the name right now. It'll unfortunately come to me later. But I think in that it's a lot of, like I said, the identity, and you're definitely going to have like the school politics. That was a trope that I didn't get to talk about a lot with you guys, but I still think is important is politics in terms of, I don't think of politics as like political parties, but if we're thinking about tropes as being about relationships, then thinking about, what are the politics of the family? What are the politics of school, which would be huge with YA, and what are the politics of any kind of work group or athletic group or anything like that. And so it's really like that's another important thing to think about when you're working on these but anyway, that would definitely be something that you would see with young adult. And I can't think of what that is, but I will think of what it is and let you guys like know afterward the book and movie that I'm thinking of, because I read it and it's like so annoying because I can.
Good Girl's Guide to Murder.
Little Girl's Guide to Murder. Thank you, person, whoever said that. I would check that out because I thought that was really interesting of a way to do a YA thriller. Good Girl's Guide. Yes. I knew it had like and it has like all these very tropey words in the title, right? It was like, I just couldn't think of it. I could see as a dark-haired young woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay.
If anybody wants to scroll back, we have a link to Jennifer's socials on the chat, and also her website and the Amazon link for her trope thesaurus,
Yeah.
which
Thanks.
will be great. I did want to let everybody know.
Oh, Josh Green. Yeah, somebody is saying Josh Green. Yeah, I just can see the chat things. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I
I'm
wanted to
sorry.
let everybody know at 3:30. So if you are local, please hoof it to Face in a Book up in El Dorado Hills. Starting at 3:30, Karen Phillips, who is our very own vice president of capital crimes, is launching her next Rocky Nelson boxing mystery. It's the second book in the series. I've had a chance to read it. It's wonderful. And her book launches are always really, really fun. And you might even get to try on boxing gloves. I don't know, no guarantees, but that is from 3:30 to 5:30 up at Face in a Book, which is 4359 Town Center Boulevard in El Dorado Hills. So if you're able to make that event for Karen, that would be fantastic.
I just have to say, I'm not familiar with her as a writer, but if you want an example of somebody who's written a really good blurb, that's a very good blurb that she wrote. Has a lot of that blurb she had a lot of really good tropes in it, but they were specific to her story. So I think that's like a whole other topic. But
Oh,
but I
and
was just,
the book, the blurb right on the cover there, or
yeah, the blurb that you just showed from the boxing lady. I was just reading it as you had it up there, and she does a really nice job of how to use tropes in her blurb. So anyway, just
oh,
FYI.
that
Yeah,
was me.
yeah, yeah. So because that's like a whole other topic, but it's like an important thing. So it's good that's like a good example of somebody who obviously did it very well.
Thank you. I wrote that.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, you did a very nice job. I had no idea.
So I
Sorry.
stumbled into it. Okay.
Oh, okay, cool.
Oh,
Yeah, you
so
did a really nice job.
that is interesting.
Yeah.
To take those and use them to construct
Yep.
a blurb
Yep.
or a
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
kind of thing. No,
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
another great application for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for having me, you guys. It's really fun. And if you think of any suggestions, please just feel free to email me. It's like I said, this was my first time doing it, and I always need like it takes a little bit to settle in with the new talk. So
Well, we appreciate your time, especially on a Saturday afternoon. It's been fantastic to learn so much and kind of get a different framework for attacking a work in progress. So,
yeah, great.
so thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And if you want to stop by at any of our other meetings, we would love to have you.
Well, I'll keep in touch, and big shout out to Eileen Rendell, who's one of your members, and she does a lot of editing for me, and I love her dearly, and she was the one who set me up with you guys. So
yes, yeah.
We
definitely have Eileen to thank for that.
Yeah.
Love you back.
Yeah, she's an awesome lady. Well, thanks so much for having me.
All right. Well, thank you. And if you can make it to Karen's, please do.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds
We'll
good.
see you next month. Thanks, everybody.